Every 3 seconds, somewhere in the world, someone develops dementia. Not every minute, not every hour, every 3 seconds. While you watch this video, hundreds of people around the world will cross that threshold, and most of them had no idea it was coming. Dementia is now one of the leading causes of disability and dependency in adults, over 60 globally, affecting nearly 55 million people. And that number is expected to nearly triple by 2050. But here's what the research consistently shows, and what rarely gets explained in a rushed 15-minute appointment. The brain doesn't simply shut down without warning. In many cases, it sends very specific signals years, sometimes decades, before any formal diagnosis. Signals that are easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to age, to stress, to a bad night's sleep. You just need to know how to recognize them. That's exactly what this video is about. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. This channel covers the research that matters most for people over 50, explained the way it should have been explained to you all along. Clearly, calmly, without rushing. Hit the like button if this topic is important to you. And stay with me, because what you're about to hear could matter enormously. For you, or for someone you love. Let's start with something important. There's a difference between normal age-related memory changes and something that actually deserves medical attention. Normal aging does affect memory. Names take a moment longer to come. Processing slows a little. You occasionally misplace your keys. These things are real, and they're part of how the brain changes after 50. That's not what this video is about. What this video is about is a different category of change. Changes that go beyond the normal drift. Changes that interfere with familiar, automatic tasks. Changes that are noticeable to the people around you, even when you're not fully aware of them yourself. The medical literature draws a clear distinction between benign age-related forgetfulness and what researchers call mild cognitive impairment. Changes that are measurable, meaningful, and in many cases, a precursor to something that needs to be addressed early. And here is the central idea that the research keeps returning to: if something is predictable, it is at least partly preventable. That is what this video is about. To understand why the brain sends warning signs before a more serious problem emerges, you first need to understand what's actually happening inside. Think of the brain as a city, a vast, intricate city with billions of roads connecting every neighborhood to every other neighborhood. These roads are your neurons and the connections between them, called synapses. When the city is young and healthy, traffic flows in every direction. Information moves fast. Connections are rich and redundant. If one road is closed, traffic reroutes easily. What research consistently shows is that in conditions like Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, a protein called amyloid beta, a kind of biological waste product, begins accumulating in the spaces between neurons, forming sticky plaques that clog the city's roads. This process can begin 15 to 20 years before any symptoms appear. Another protein, called tau, also begins to malfunction, tangling inside neurons like knotted cables inside the city's communication lines, eventually killing those cells entirely. At the same time, neuroinflammation, inflammation inside the brain itself, driven by the brain's immune cells called microglia, begins to damage surrounding tissue. Think of road repair crews that, instead of fixing the damage, start tearing up healthy pavement. And blood vessel damage, which reduces the brain's oxygen and nutrient supply, compounds everything. The city doesn't collapse all at once. It loses roads, one by one. And for a long time, the brain compensates. It reroutes, recruits other areas, works harder. The warning signs you're about to hear appear in that compensatory phase. They are the city's traffic problems before the gridlock. And they are worth paying attention to. The first warning sign is getting lost in familiar places or on familiar routes. You've driven the same road to the grocery store 100 times, maybe 1,000 times. You know every turn, every traffic light, every landmark, and then one day you hesitate. You take a wrong turn, you drive past your own street, or you find yourself momentarily unsure of where you are, even in your own neighborhood. You pull over, you look around, and after a moment, it comes back to you. You shake it off, tell yourself you were distracted, thinking about something else. And that's exactly what most people do. They blame distraction, tiredness, too much on their mind. Maybe they were listening to the radio, maybe they'd had a difficult morning. The rationalization comes easily, and it makes sense. We all zone out while driving sometimes. But what the research on early cognitive change shows is something different. Spatial navigation, your brain's ability to build and maintain mental maps of the world, is handled by the hippocampus, a small seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain that is among the very first regions affected by amyloid accumulation. The hippocampus is the city's master map room. When it begins to lose its precision, the first thing to go is often the ability to navigate familiar places. Not new ones, but places you've stopped consciously thinking about because your body just knew the way. When that automatic knowledge suddenly requires effort, when the familiar feels unfamiliar, that is the hippocampus signaling distress. The important distinction is this: forgetting an address you heard once is normal. Getting disoriented on a route you've driven 1,000 times is not. One is a failure to encode something new. The other is a failure of deep, consolidated spatial memory, the kind that doesn't fade with tiredness. If you've noticed this more than once, it's worth bringing to your doctor's attention. Spatial disorientation in familiar environments, when it becomes a pattern, is one of the earliest documented signals in case series of people who went on to receive dementia diagnoses years later. The second warning sign is losing the thread of a conversation mid-sentence. You're at dinner with family. Someone asks you a question and you start answering, confident, ready. And then, somewhere in the middle of your own sentence, the thought simply vanishes, not like a word on the tip of your tongue. The whole idea, the entire direction of what you were saying is gone. You pause, you look for it. You might say, "I've lost my train of thought," and laugh it off, or change the subject, or ask the other person to remind you what you were talking about. It happens to everyone sometimes, you tell yourself. You were talking too fast, you got distracted, there's too much going on. And once or twice, that's probably true. But what neurologists and cognitive researchers consistently observe is that when this becomes a pattern, when word finding breaks down frequently, when the middle of your own sentences feels like a sudden drop, it may reflect something specific happening in the language and working memory networks of the brain. Working memory is your brain's whiteboard. It holds the information you're actively using right now, including the thread of what you're saying. The prefrontal cortex and temporal lobe work together to keep that whiteboard legible. When these regions begin to lose connectivity, when the roads between them start breaking down, the whiteboard gets erased too quickly. You can't finish the thought because the beginning of it is already gone by the time you reach the middle. The distinction that matters. Normal aging produces a missing word, a name that won't come while the rest of the thought stays intact. You say, "What's his name?" The actor from the 80s. Everything else is there. What's worth noting is when the whole structure of the thought collapses while you're inside it. That is a deeper disruption in how the brain organizes active information. If this is happening with increasing frequency, it deserves a conversation with a doctor. The third warning sign is repeatedly asking the same question without realizing it. Let's imagine a common situation. A 72-year-old retired man has been looking forward to visiting his daughter for weeks. He asks her on Monday what time she's picking him up. She tells him, "Saturday at noon." He thanks her, hangs up, and then calls her again on Tuesday to ask the same question, and again on Wednesday. By Thursday, she's answered the same question 4 times. Each time, he has no memory of having asked before. In families, this pattern often gets absorbed slowly. People answer the question again, each time telling themselves it's just forgetfulness, and the person asking rarely realizes they're doing it, because the conversation was never encoded into long-term memory in the first place. This is the real mechanism. Encoding new information into long-term memory requires a process called memory consolidation, which depends heavily on the hippocampus. When the hippocampus is compromised, new experiences, phone calls, conversations, what happened this morning, don't get written into stable memory. They exist briefly in working memory and then evaporate. So the question gets asked again, not because the person forgot the answer, they never formed a lasting memory of asking in the first place. It's like writing on sand at the edge of the tide. The wave comes and the writing disappears. The contrast with normal aging is precise. Forgetting the content of a phone call from 3 weeks ago is normal. Asking the same question multiple times in a single day with no awareness of having asked before is different. One is retrieval difficulty. The memory exists but is hard to reach. The other is encoding failure. The memory was never made. That distinction is one of the clearest markers in the clinical literature between benign forgetfulness and early cognitive decline. Let me stop here for a second, because I think something needs to be said. You've just heard 3 warning signs, and I know what some of you are thinking right now. I've done that. I've gotten confused driving somewhere. I've lost my train of thought. I've asked the same question twice, and now you're worried. I understand that. I want to be very direct with you about this. One instance of any of these things is not a diagnosis. A single disoriented moment on a familiar road doesn't mean your brain is in trouble. The word that matters in every one of these signs is pattern. A change that is new, that is happening with increasing frequency, that is noticeable to others, not just to you. That feels different from who you have always been. That is the signal worth paying attention to. Not any isolated moment, but a pattern of change. And if you're watching this because you're concerned about someone you love, a parent, a sibling, a partner, send them this video. Or bring it to a doctor's appointment together, because early awareness changes outcomes. The research consistently shows this. The window for meaningful intervention is real, and it is open longer than most people think. The 4th warning sign is difficulty with familiar tasks that used to be automatic. You've been making the same chicken recipe for 30 years. You don't use a recipe card anymore. You haven't needed one in decades. You know this dish the way you know your own face in the mirror. And then one afternoon, you find yourself standing in the kitchen, uncertain. What goes in first? How long does it cook? You find yourself reading the box of ingredients on the shelf just to confirm something you've done hundreds of times. Or you go to pay a bill you've always handled without thinking, and the sequence of steps suddenly feels foreign. Or you sit down to use an appliance you've used for years and can't recall the steps in the right order. Of course, you tell yourself you're distracted, tired. I was thinking about something else. And maybe you were. But the research makes an important distinction. The ability to plan and sequence complex tasks, called executive function hay, is handled by the frontal lobes. When the city's roads start breaking down, the frontal lobes can lose their ability to organize even deeply familiar procedures. The recipe you could make in your sleep suddenly needs to be thought through step by step. The automatic becomes effortful. Normal aging might make you slower at learning something new. It should not make you unable to execute something you've done hundreds of times. When the deeply practiced suddenly becomes unreliable, when the familiar requires active concentration, that is an executive function signal worth bringing to a doctor. The 5th warning sign is sudden changes in personality, mood, or behavior that feel out of character. This one is often the hardest for families to name. Not because it's subtle, sometimes it's the most visible change of all, but because it doesn't look like a memory problem. It looks like a personality problem, an attitude problem. Sometimes it looks like depression. Sometimes it looks like paranoia. A gentle, patient person becomes irritable. Someone who was social and warm starts withdrawing, refusing invitations, pulling away from relationships they've maintained for decades. A trusting person begins to suspect their family of stealing from them, of lying, of conspiring against them. The person themselves may not be aware of the change. They may feel like their suspicion is entirely justified, like they have always been this way. And the family absorbs it, sometimes for years before connecting it to anything medical. What the research describes in early dementia and related conditions is a disruption in the brain's emotional regulation systems. The amygdala, the anterior cingulate cortex, the frontal lobes, that affects how a person reads social situations and manages emotional responses. When the city's traffic management system breaks down, signals start misfiring. Neutral situations get interpreted as threatening. Normal frustration escalates beyond proportion. Apathy, a profound flatness of emotional engagement, very different from sadness, begins to replace previous warmth and interest. The contrast that matters, personality naturally softens and evolves across a lifetime. A 70-year-old is not the same person they were at 40, and that's normal. What is not normal is a sharp, discontinuous change. A person who was cheerful and engaged becoming persistently withdrawn. A person who was trusting and cooperative becoming accusatory and hostile. The key word is discontinuous. A noticeable break from who this person has consistently been. When family members say he's just not himself anymore and can point to when that change began, the research suggests that's not a social observation. It may be a clinical one. Now, pay attention because this is important. There are several things that medical literature consistently shows are among the most powerful, modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline, and they're not what most people expect. Sleep is one of the most critical and most underappreciated. The brain has a waste-clearing system called the glymphatic system, a network of channels that opens during deep sleep to flush out metabolic waste products, including amyloid beta, the protein that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease. Think of it as the city's overnight sanitation crew. They only operate when the city is quiet, when traffic has stopped, when roads are free. Chronic sleep disruption, getting less than 7 hours, poor quality sleep, untreated sleep apnea, means the sanitation crew can't do their work. The waste accumulates. Research from multiple large studies links poor sleep, especially over years and decades, with significantly higher risk of cognitive decline. This is not a minor association. Sleep is when the brain cleans itself. One thing many people get wrong is the belief that cognitive decline is essentially genetic, that if your parents didn't get dementia, you won't, and if they did, you will. The genetics of dementia are more nuanced than that. Carrying a variant of the APOE gene called APOE4 does raise risk, sometimes substantially, but it is not a destiny. The research consistently shows that lifestyle factors, sleep, blood pressure control, physical activity, hearing loss management, social engagement modify that risk meaningfully. Environment matters as much as, and sometimes more than, genetics in determining who actually develops dementia and at what age. High blood pressure in midlife, particularly in your 40s and 50s, is one of the most consistently identified modifiable risk factors for dementia in later life. The mechanism runs through vascular damage. Chronically elevated blood pressure damages the small blood vessels that supply the brain, reducing blood flow over years and contributing to a type of damage called white matter lesions, visible on brain MRI. These lesions disrupt the brain's internal communication pathways. The road damage compounds over decades. Managing blood pressure, in conversation with your doctor with the approach they recommend, is not just heart protection, it is brain protection. Hearing loss is another factor that surprises most people. Large longitudinal studies following thousands of adults over decades consistently show that untreated hearing loss in midlife is associated with significantly increased dementia risk. The mechanism involves the cognitive load of straining to hear every conversation, social withdrawal that naturally follows hearing difficulty, and reduced sensory input to the brain's auditory processing areas. Hearing aids, when used consistently, appear to reduce this risk. If you've been putting off a hearing check, that's worth reconsidering. Physical activity has one of the most robust evidence bases in cognitive health research. Regular movement, even brisk walking, increases blood flow to the brain, promotes the release of a protein called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor and acts like fertilizer for neurons and reduces systemic inflammation. Studies consistently link physical activity with reduced dementia risk and with larger hippocampal volume in older adults. The hippocampus responds to exercise in measurable, documented ways. Social isolation is the final risk factor worth naming. Human brains were built to operate in community. Sustained social engagement exercises language, emotional reading, working memory, and planning. When that engagement decreases, those circuits get less use, like any road in the city that stops carrying traffic. Studies link chronic social isolation to significantly elevated dementia risk. Investing in relationships, even when it's effortful, is not a luxury. The research suggests it may be essential. Before we continue, I need to make one thing clear. Everything you're hearing in this video is information. Information grounded in research intended to help you have better conversations with your doctor. This is not a checklist for self-diagnosis. The symptoms described here can have many explanations, including some that are highly treatable and completely unrelated to dementia. Thyroid dysfunction, vitamin B12 deficiency, medication side effects, depression, urinary tract infections in older adults, and more. A good evaluation by a doctor is the only way to understand what's actually happening. Please, if you are concerned about yourself or someone you love, make that appointment. Now let's talk about what to do, specifically what questions to bring to your next medical appointment. The first is a cognitive assessment. The most widely used screening tool is called the MOCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It tests memory, attention, language, spatial skills, and executive function in about 10 to 15 minutes. It gives a doctor a baseline, a starting number that can be tracked over time. If you or someone in your family has noticed changes, asking your doctor to administer the MOCA is a reasonable, concrete step. It won't give a diagnosis on its own, but baselines matter. Cognitive change is only visible when you have a reference point to compare against. The second is a conversation about APOE genotype testing. The APOE gene, specifically which variant you carry, is the most common genetic risk factor for late-onset Alzheimer's disease. The APOE4 variant raises risk but does not determine outcome. Not carrying it doesn't eliminate risk. Many physicians and genetic counselors advise careful consideration before testing because results need to be interpreted within a full clinical picture, and the emotional weight of the result matters. What's worth asking your doctor is whether genetic risk assessment makes sense for you, given your family history and your goals. It's a conversation, not a reflex test. The third is a discussion about blood-based biomarkers. In recent years, blood tests that detect amyloid and tau proteins, the same proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's disease, have advanced significantly. They offer the prospect of much earlier, much simpler detection of biological changes, years before symptoms become obvious. The field is moving fast. Asking your doctor whether any of these assessments are relevant to your situation is a worthwhile conversation, particularly if you have a strong family history or are already noticing changes. Let's take a moment to bring the 5 warning signs together. The first was getting lost in familiar places or on familiar routes, a sign of early hippocampal disruption, the brain's map room beginning to lose precision. The second was losing the thread of a conversation mid-sentence, a sign of working memory and frontal temporal connectivity beginning to falter. The third was repeatedly asking the same question without realizing it, the clearest sign of encoding failure, when new experiences stop being written into lasting memory. The fourth was difficulty with familiar tasks that used to be automatic, a sign that executive function, the brain's sequencing and planning capacity, is under pressure. The fifth was out-of-character personality or mood changes, irritability, suspicion, withdrawal, signs that the brain's emotional regulation systems are being disrupted. None of these, in isolation, is a diagnosis. All of them, as patterns, are worth a conversation with a doctor. And that conversation, if it happens early, opens a window. Research consistently shows that interventions, medical, lifestyle-based, pharmacological, where appropriate, are more effective earlier. The window for meaningful action is not closed. For many people, it is still open. One more thing before we close. It's never too late. The research on brain plasticity is one of the most hopeful areas in all of neuroscience. The brain you have at 60 is not fixed. At 70, it is not fixed. Neuroplasticity research consistently shows that the brain responds to the right environment, to sleep, to movement, to social engagement, to mental challenge, in ways that are real and measurable. The city can build new roads. The question is giving it the conditions to do so. Everything you've seen in this video is general information based on current research. It does not replace, under any circumstances, individual medical advice. Your doctor knows your history, your lab results, the medications you take, and the full picture of your health. Bring this information to your next appointment and have the conversation. Your doctor is your partner in this, not the enemy. If you are currently taking medication for any cognitive or mood condition, do not stop or adjust it on your own. Ever. If you found this video helpful, please share it with someone who might need it. A parent, a friend, a sibling who keeps brushing off changes that worry the family. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make sure the right information reaches the right person at the right time. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a comment below. Tell me which of these 5 signs you'd never heard described that way before. I read every comment. Take care of your brain. It has been working for you every minute of your life, without asking for anything in return. It deserves this attention.